everyone. My name is Mark Cantor. I am the president of the Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program, the biennial Switzer Cooper Lecture. Of course, congratulations to this year's winner, Sharon Graham. At this time, I would like to acknowledge that we are hosting this event from our homes on Treaty 1 land, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, and Dakota peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. The mission of the Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada is to document, preserve, and share information on the culture and historical formation of Jewish communities in Western Canada. The Jewish Heritage Center also serves as an advocate for anti-racism and education on the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. Our vision is to forge a pathway to the future by preserving and sharing compelling stories and educating present and future generations. What better way to achieve this vision than through programs such as the one tonight? I encourage you to visit our website to learn of our upcoming virtual events. You can visit our website at jhcwc.org, jhcwc.org. On October 25, we are hosting an exciting three-part online program on anti-Semitism in fascist Italy. 2 workshops will be held at 1:30 p.m. and 3 p.m. At 4 p.m., we will screen the docudrama Figlio del Destino, translation Children of Destiny, with the participation of the director Marco Spagnoli from Rome. From October 15 to November 15, the Jewish Heritage Center is proud to host the only Canadian showing of the Stolperstein, translation Stumbling Stones, the exhibition which will be held in our Holocaust Education Museum. This exhibition will culminate in a community-wide virtual Kristallnacht event on November 9th in partnership with the Jewish Federation of Winnipeg. I remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded, and I now call upon Dan Stone to introduce Paul Switzer.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to get involved once again in what's now the 7th biennial Switzer Cooperstock lecture. The Jewish Heritage Center was delighted to have been approached by Paul Switzer as representative of the Switzer family of now 15 years ago and more, to set up these prize lectures. And they have contributed a great deal to the Jewish Heritage Center and generally to the spread of information and knowledge and understanding of Jewish history in Western Canada. Paul Switzer is a Winnipegger. He went to St. John's Tech and the University of Manitoba before going on to do graduate work at Harvard and settling into an academic profession, which brought him to Stanford University, where he made his career. And a very distinguished career it is. Paul is now Professor Emeritus of Statistics and also of environmental studies, environmental sciences there. Despite his long distance from Winnipeg, he has remembered Winnipeg and, of course, the Winnipeg members of his family, and has come to each of the lectures since the initiation, the first one in 2008. We're very sorry that we don't see him in person this year, but at least we can get an image of him virtually. Welcome, Paul, and thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Dan. Dan's review of my schooling did omit the most important part. And that was my formative years at the Winnipeg IL Parachute, which was a bilingual day school. And I was known then, and I'm still known, by the way, by my Yiddish name, which is Penny. And a lot of you who are listening to this program today, this lecture, will know me by that name. The Switzer Cooperstock Prize was established to honor our parents. And let me show you a better picture. Is that working?
The picture is visible behind you, but if you were wanted to share a
Okay.
screen, then it didn't turn up.
Well, let me go back then. Okay, well, there's a little grainy picture of them. The prize was established on our parents, Rose Cooperstock and Louis Switzer, who were both immigrants to Winnipeg. And they met and were married here in Winnipeg in 1936. And that's a picture of them. I believe it's their engagement picture. Rose immigrated in 1912 with her family. She was then 6 years old. She grew up on the farm in Lorette, Manitoba, and later moving to Winnipeg, where she worked for the Burgess Battery Company. And during much of her married life, she worked at the Counter Guns Bakery. Louis immigrated in 1929 at age 20 with his family, soon found work on the shop floor at the Dominion Electric Company, owned by the Walensky and Sector families. He worked at Dominion Electric continuously for 45 years until his retirement. Rose and Louis purchased their first modest home in 1942 at 451 Magnus Avenue in Winnipeg's ethnic North End, where brother Fred and I spent our early formative years and attended the nearby Parrott School. They moved to West Gladone in 1957 and spent their last years at the Rush Venus Senior Residence, built on the very site of the Winnipeg Jewish Orphanage, about which you will hear more about today. And speaking for Fred and myself, we very much look forward to today's presentation by Dr. Sharon Graham. And speaking of Fred, by the way, today is his birthday. We don't see him live on his picture, but he's a very handsome guy. So I want to use this opportunity to wish him many more happy birthdays. And back to you, Dan.
Thank you, Paul. I'm sure this will be a very good birthday present for him, but probably not the only one that he'll receive. This, as I said, is the 7th biennial award. I'm going to run very briefly through the kinds of topics which have turned up. That is the first one in 2008, Professor Theodore Friedgood, originally from Regina, a family that was in the Lipton Farm Colony. Professor Friedgood has been a professor at the Hebrew University for decades, professor emeritus now. And he was doing original research on the Lipton Farm Colony, followed by Hannah Tao, a Winnipeg independent scholar who did an oral history project and collections on Jews in smaller cities or smaller towns in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and put this together very informatively. And then following that, Professor Lynn Marks, University of Victoria, with an essay on Jewish identity in early British Columbia, followed by David Kaufman of York University, who explored what was called the Indian curio trade, not a term that would be used these days, but the Jewish traders who went out and bought everything from insignificant items to very significant ritual artifacts, as was the style of the day. Ethel Jones, professor at the University of Manitoba, did a terrific job in 2016 on Mindel Cherniak-Sheps, and who was instrumental in creating the Medicare in Saskatchewan in 1944, but ran into various problems. As the name suggests, Cherniak-Sheps, she was a Winnipegger. And last time in 2018, Richard Menkes, professor at UBC, many topics. He explored the different roads of two rabbis who traveled across Western Canada and visited Winnipeg, among other places. So there's quite a variety of possibilities, and I would encourage everybody in 2 years to apply for this one. Or please remember that the Switzer family has initiated a student prize, which is yet to be awarded. So if you're an undergraduate or a graduate student and you would like to work in the field of Western Canadian Jewish history, you may get a reward out of it. Watch for an announcement, and please keep in touch with us if you want to follow this up. But tonight's winner is Sharon Graham, a Toronto native, but a resident of Winnipeg for quite a while. She has a BA and MA from York University, specializing in art history and working particularly on synagogue architecture. In Winnipeg, she's worked in various community activities, especially at Cher Zedek, and she was the general manager for a year at the Heritage Center, where she made many wonderful contributions before she was able to start her doctoral program, which, as you know, has resulted in the dissertation on building Canadian Jewish citizens out of abandoned children in Western Canada, the Winnipeg Jewish Orphanage, 1917 to 1948. Tonight's talk is not an excerpt from the dissertation. It's an exploration of a topic that didn't fit very well into the dissertation as such. So this is new material. Sharon has continued to be a volunteer and in quite a variety of activities here in the National Council of Jewish Women. She's worked with the Archives Committee of the Heritage Center. She works with the Jewish Federation of Winnipeg and Jewish Engagement Coordinator. She's won numerous awards and scholarships, and she has done active research on various projects through the Jewish Heritage Center. So I'm very pleased to introduce Sharon. Just one more word for this. She will give an illustrated talk, and then at the end of it, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. That is, you can pose the questions. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Please don't use the chat line for posing questions afterwards. That will make it a little easier to sort out things. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat line, but please use the Q&A because we'll know exactly what that's for. I'll relay the questions to Sharon, who will give oral answers to this. And I think that's it. So thank you very much. And Sharon, please, let's hear about it. It's not coming through. The sound isn't on. No, I can't hear it anyway.
How's this?
Good, thank you.
Okay. I'd like to thank you, Dan, very much. And I'd also like to thank the Switzer family for donating this generous prize. I'm very honored to accept this award. And I really appreciate all the work that the Jewish Heritage Center does. The research in this essay could not have been possible without the help of the Jewish Heritage Center and its archival staff, including Andrew Morrison. And it also couldn't have been possible without the extensive support of the Jewish Child and Family Service of Winnipeg, especially Al Benarosh, its executive director, who helped me gain access to the records that I will reference that I used for my doctoral dissertation. I'd also like to thank Dr. Stephanie Bangarth, who was on my doctoral committee, who suggested that I look into this particular topic, as well as, of course, all my supervisor and other doctoral help that I received from the University of Manitoba. And of course, I always wish to thank my family and my partner for all their invaluable support. So I will begin. I just want to make clear before I start my essay that all photos in the presentation are from the Jewish Heritage Center unless otherwise noted. I was very lucky in that the Maida Markson of the Silver family sent me a few personal photos of Pearl, and I really appreciate them. I'm using them today. So I will get started. Just going to start screen sharing here. How do I do this? Share screen. Okay. Here we go. Okay. So my presentation tonight is about Pearl Finkelstein, Unknown Hero. And the photo here was supplied by Maida Markson. I think this was taken around the time that she was working in the orphanage, or perhaps a little bit afterwards. Okay, I will get started. The Winnipeg Jewish Orphanage housed children from 1917 until 1948, and for a long portion of its existence, it was served by an untrained social worker, Pearl Finkelstein, later Mrs. Saul Silver. Finkelstein had volunteered with the Jewish orphanage as a young woman and was hired to succeed the orphanage's first social worker, Bertha Coyle. Unlike Mrs. Coyle, who had worked at the orphanage as a nurse, Finkelstein had not worked formally within a childcare setting. But instead of searching for a trained social worker, the board and superintendent of the orphanage chose a woman who had grown up within the Jewish community of Manitoba and who intimately knew the families she served. By doing so, the Jewish community gained a worker who was emotionally invested in protecting her community's children and families from illness and distress, but who also lacked the perspective to address the root causes of poverty that harmed her clients' families. In this lecture, I will expand upon my doctoral research on the Winnipeg Jewish Orphanage in order to explore how Pearl Finkelstein was able to assist families in crisis, and I will situate Finkelstein within the Canadian social work profession. Using my research in the children's records of the orphanage, I will reconstruct Finkelstein's approach to community, service, and addressing the causes of poverty. I hope to use this presentation to prompt deeper discussions about female workers in the Winnipeg Jewish community and to raise awareness of the work of this relatively unknown public service. My research was informed by many sources, but the majority of my findings regarding Pearl Finkelstein's work was found in the collection.
Sharon, the sound has gotten lost again. The sound got lost. We can't hear you. No.
No?
No. Now, yes.
Now, yes? I'm going to try my earbuds again just because, it's better when they do work. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. These are more comfortable. Okay. So I'm looking at the collection of the orphanage's children's records, which are now held by the Winnipeg Jewish Child and Family Service. Citing the children's records is important because the full scope of Finkelstein's work with the families of the Winnipeg Jewish community was otherwise not recorded. I also consulted a series of oral history interviews conducted with Finkelstein, which are now held by the Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada. There we go. Okay, so first I'm just going to do an extremely short history of the Winnipeg Jewish Orphanage, whose existence created Finkelstein's work. Originally, 2 Jewish orphanages were established in Winnipeg in response to a 1912 community rumor that Jewish children were being housed in Christian orphanages. In 1913, both orphanages, the Canadian Jewish Orphanage and the Esther Robinson Jewish Orphanage and Children's Aid Society, began housing children in rented homes. In 1917, the 2 orphanages were amalgamated into one better supported institution, known as the Western Canadian Jewish Orphans Home and Children's Aid Society. The children were moved into a modern, fireproof, and spacious building.
The sound has gone off again. The sound is, there's no sound right now.
Now,
Now
sorry?
it's good.
oh, good. The location of the orphanage is now housing the Rosh Pina housing complex, and it is right next door to Eitz Chaim Synagogue. Pearl Finkelstein was hired by the superintendent Aaron Osofsky, a man who began his career with the orphanage, like Finkelstein, as a volunteer. Osofsky was a passionate writer who cared deeply about raising the Jewish children of Western Canada, but he was also
It's fallen off again, I'm sorry to say. Sharon, the sound has stopped. Sharon,
Yiddish newspaper.
we
Sorry?
lost the sound for a moment.
Okay, I'm gonna try holding it.
I think it might be better to not use the headphones. It might be causing an issue.
Okay.
Greg's the technical expert.
Okay, I'll try like this. In 1935, Wilder opened the orphanage up to boarding students from rural areas who were sent to the orphanage so that they could attend Winnipeg public schools and the supplementary Talmud Torah school on site. Wilder was open to criticism of the orphanage, and he commissioned a review of the institution by Irving K. First, who was supervisor of the Jewish Children's Bureau of Chicago in 1939. First recommended closing the orphanage, as he found several problems with it and believed that in many cases, families could be supported directly. In April of 1945, a committee report was submitted to the board that reopened the discussion about closing the orphanage, as its population was steadily declining from 95 children in 1931 to 49 children in 1944. The orphanage was closed to the children of Western Canada by 1948, although teenagers who were brought to Winnipeg as Holocaust refugees spent some time in the building while their foster homes were being arranged. And that's really the end of the orphanage. Next, I'm going to discuss Pearl Finkelstein from volunteer to social worker. The lives of social workers can illuminate both the limits and the possibilities of one person. That was actually not my idea. That was Suzanne Morton, a scholar who I'll discuss later. Pearl Finkelstein, social worker, was a woman who had worked through the volunteer structure of the orphanage to become one of Winnipeg Social Services key employees. Born in 1896, Finkelstein was the granddaughter of Tevel Finkelstein, one of the first Jewish settlers in Winnipeg. As a member of one of the founding families of the Winnipeg Jewish community, she was deeply invested in the creation and maintenance of Jewish community institutions. In her 1968 oral history, recorded under her married name of Mrs. Saul Silver, Finkelstein described her childhood within the close community of the Winnipeg Jewish community, of the Manitoba, community, where her family prospered and lived a comfortable life. In addition to her volunteer work with the Orphanage Girls Auxiliary, Finkelstein in her youth was involved with the National Council of Jewish Women Juniors. In 1931, she began working for the orphanage as a paid social worker. Next slide, here we go.
There's no sound right now. Sharon, sound isn't coming through, and we've lost the sound, Sharon.
was finding jobs for the teens who were aging out of the orphanage into the grim employment prospects of 1930s Winnipeg. Most of this work was conducted face-to-face, meeting with employers at their factories to try to persuade them to take on an unskilled teenager. But Finkelstein also worked very hard with parents who had made the first call for help from the Jewish orphanage for childcare. Without professional training, Finkelstein relied on her extensive networks within the Jewish community and Winnipeg at large, and her sympathetic temperament to help her clients. Unlike other social workers that I found who were writing in the children's records, Finkelstein seemed to have very little interest in her clients' sex lives, the reasons for any business failures, or their arguments with their neighbors, unless those problems had contributed to the crisis. Many children spent a short amount of time in the orphanage, staying there temporarily while their parents or a lone parent coped with the crisis. But their family's involvement with the Jewish social worker could last years, as Finkelstein sought to help people who had few financial or social resources. Families needed help in navigating the complex requirements of local social welfare organizations. Now, I'm going to discuss some case studies here, and I should point out that although they use letter initials, these letter initials do not represent their names. I anonymized the records even in my note-taking. I have no idea who these people are. And so I hope I don't go into too many details that reveal who they actually are, but if you hear the sort of letter acronym I used for their names, it's not related to a real name. So I will now discuss the case of Mrs. J.D. Help was required for this family for a period of 5 years. Mrs. J.D. was a single mother whose husband was in jail in the United States. During her first few months of receiving attention from the Winnipeg Children's Bureau, Mrs. J.D. was assigned a non-Jewish social worker who focused on her sexual history, as Mrs. J.D. was suffering from a sexually transmitted infection. After 3 months, however, Mrs. Coyle, the first Jewish orphanage social worker, took over and worked with Mr. Tony of the Social Welfare Council to get Mrs. J.D. established in her own home. The mother's health was still poor, however, and she was about to have surgery when she asked for Finkelstein's help after Coyle had retired. During the course of placing one of the J.D. children in the orphanage, Mrs. J.D. told Finkelstein that her hospital bills for the planned surgery were refused coverage by the city of Winnipeg, even though the doctors had offered to waive their fees. Finkelstein then called Mr. Levadi of the Social Welfare Council, who worked with St. Joseph's Hospital to ensure that the orphanage would not cost the mother. Finkelstein then worked with Ms. Stoller, the social worker of the General Hospital, to find funding for a medical corset from the National Council of Jewish Women. Mrs. J.D. then left town for work, but when she returned, she needed help finding an apartment, and Finkelstein traveled around the city with her to find an appropriate place for the family. Finkelstein then worked with the United Hebrew Relief social worker, Miss Ginsburg, to arrange for financial help to cover the shortfall between relief payments and rent. She also worked again with the National Council of Jewish Women to arrange for a loan of a go-kart when one of Mrs. J.D.'s children broke his leg. When it was time for the J.D. children to attend the afternoon Talmud Torah school for religious education, Finkelstein ensured that the mother would not have to pay tuition. Mrs. J.D. then needed emergency medical care again, and her children were admitted temporarily to the orphanage for a third time. Over 5 years, Coyle, but especially Finkelstein, were not only helping Mrs. J.D. admit her children to the orphanage, but were coordinating between various government and charitable organizations in order to ensure that the family received what they needed. Finkelstein, with her extensive contacts within the Jewish charitable world and within the social service sector, could get things done. Now, this is a photo from the City of Winnipeg archives. I wanted to show just a general street scene of the North End in the time period under consideration. Unfortunately, I don't get a chance in this paper to talk about the farmers market, but that's some of what Winnipeg in the North End looked like in the 1930s. The other part of Finkelstein's job was helping teens transition from the orphanage to adult life, and she often had to use her contacts in the Jewish community to find teens jobs and boarding or foster homes. The story of the ZK children is a complex one. They spent many years in the orphanage after their mother died and their father disappeared to the United States. Problems occurred for these children when it was time for them to find their way in the world. They had been made formal wards of the orphanage in order to secure municipal funding for their maintenance. But both the province of Manitoba and the city of Winnipeg considered children to be grown by 16 and refused to fund their support after that age. The Orphanage Ladies Auxiliary provided teens who were leaving with some clothes and other personal possessions before they left. But even the new clothes and possessions provided by the Ladies Auxiliary didn't help. The records show that most teens were just not ready to live on their own at age 16. ZK1's record indicates that he fell behind on his rent to his landlady, spending his money on things like cigarettes and gambling. In order to get him to straighten up, Finkelstein recruited Superintendent Ofsovsky and members of the orphanage board to speak with ZK1 about his debts. She also helped him keep his lodgings by pleading with the landlady for mercy, and she found him a new job when he lost his old one. Now this is a teen at the orphanage in the 1940s, a little later than the period under discussion. The second sibling in the family, ZK2, a girl, was more responsible with her money, but she was also experiencing difficulties. ZK2 was very reliant on Finkelstein as she was truly alone in the world. ZK2 and the orphanage staff decided that she would train in nursing, and she was enrolled in an apprenticeship program with a local hospital. At a certain point in her training, ZK2 was required by the training program to buy a pair of white nursing shoes. Finkelstein made an appointment with her to go and get them, with the orphanage covering the cost. But Finkelstein and ZK2 ended up going to the movies instead. ZK2 explained to Finkelstein that she was probably not going to get promoted further in the program. She was indeed let go from the training course, and then she lost her room. She once again turned to the Jewish social worker, which I couldn't tell from the records, but was most likely Finkelstein, who found her a new position and a new place to live. It could be seen as unprofessional to take a client to the movies. It didn't really help her with the immediate problem. But I think that's actually a very telling anecdote, because I think what that child needed on that day from Pearl Finkelstein was just a little moment of friendship. So was Pearl Finkelstein's approach and motivation as the Winnipeg Jewish social worker unique, or was she similar to other social workers? How did her perspective inform the decisions she made on behalf of her clients? In the longer essay that I submitted for this prize, I compared Finkelstein's life, training, and career with that of Jane Wisdom, a social worker whose life was traced by Suzanne Morton in her book, Wisdom, Justice, and Charity, Canadian Social Welfare, through the life of Jane B. Wisdom. Finkelstein and Wisdom approached social work from different perspectives, and they had very different training. Although they both took up careers in social work due to a feeling of duty and care for their communities, and both expressed deep satisfaction with their careers. Finkelstein was untrained, and therefore she knew little of the theoretical ideas that were the underpinnings of her career. Her approach to families was very good at solving short-term problems, but she did not consider the underlying causes of poverty and injustice in Winnipeg. Wisdom's university training and life experiences in a number of different communities gave her a deeper insight into the underlying causes of her clients' distress and the structural forces that underpinned poverty. Like Pearl Finkelstein, Wisdom entered into a career in social work intentionally, but she remained in that profession for her entire working life. She was 12 years older than Finkelstein and a committed Presbyterian from St. John, New Brunswick. She attended the Royal Victoria College at McGill University in Montreal, and thus was able to enjoy a socially and intellectually stimulating women's university experience. Needing to work, Wisdom returned to her parents' home from her parents' home to Montreal 2 years after she graduated, and she was hired as one of the first paid visitors, an early term for social work, for the Montreal Charity Organization, working among the city's poor Anglophone families. In 1910, Wisdom traveled to New York to trained for her career further, and there learned with the pioneers in casework investigations in the settlement house movement. From New York, Wisdom moved to Halifax, where she worked with a very newly established social service bureau. After the horrific Halifax explosion in 1917, Wisdom and her caseworkers became stewards of the city's Relief Commission, which struggled to provide housing and financial aid to affected families. Wisdom left Halifax in 1921 to return to Montreal in order to pursue a master's degree in social work, which she did not complete. And for 15 years after she abandoned her research, Wisdom toiled as the executive secretary for the Women's Bureau of Montreal, a charity which sought to help unwed mothers establish themselves in their own homes. Wisdom eventually returned to Nova Scotia, where she was the sole worker running the Municipal Social Welfare Office of Glace Bay. This was the post that ended Wisdom's career. She never married, but remained close to her sisters and their children, and she had close ties with other Canadian social work pioneers, including the famous Charlotte Whitten. According to the scholar Suzanne Morton, Wisdom rejected any division between expertise and professionalism and core human values. Wisdom was interested in the root causes of poverty, which led her to advocate for political solutions to societal problems. For example, her unfinished graduate work on the striking workers of Cape Breton included her perspectives on social science, interventionist government action, and industry and workers' attempts at cooperation. In her final posting in Glace Bay, Wisdom lectured in radio broadcasts about the necessity to reform Nova Scotia's antique poor laws in favor of modern legislation, which allowed for provincial standards and consistent funding for families in need. In contrast with Wisdom, Finkelstein never considered herself much of a scholar, and her education was not considered as important to her future as her marriageability. According to the oral history recording, Finkelstein was dissuaded from attending university as her paternal aunt Eva Finkelstein had done, with her mother saying, "Aunt Eva married a welder, and I don't want you to marry a welder." Wisdom's family, however, thought that she had been denied a romantic life due to the loss of a sweetheart in World War I. Finkelstein, who was younger, also considered herself to have been a romantic victim of the war, as there were fewer partners available to women of her generation. Here's a lovely photo of Pearl with her family. When she was asked to take on the role of the Jewish social worker by the orphanage, Finkelstein at first demurred. Her family was financially stable, and so she was unsure if it was proper for her to accept a salary. But the work, at first limited to finding jobs for graduating teens, was very necessary. Finkelstein was perfect for this position because she knew many of the employers in Winnipeg through her kinship networks. Finkelstein was also friends with the non-Jewish elite who grew up in the same neighborhood as she in Winnipeg, one of whom, she noted in her interview, had served in the executive of Eaton's department stores, a noted anti-Semitic firm. Her parents' friends she considered her extended family. Finkelstein could therefore call on her family's networks, her personal connections through her volunteer work, and her friendly personality to sway employers to take on teenage employees at a time when there were many laborers looking for jobs. Although her life had been consistently privileged, Finkelstein's notes never portrayed any unkindness or class prejudice towards the parents with whom she worked, many of whom were suffering from extreme poverty. It is likely that the notes that she took were required by the Winnipeg Children's Bureau, which oversaw municipal funding and had overtaken formal decision-making for childcare institutions in Winnipeg. Finkelstein's notes, however, were notably detailed and focused on solving problems. I think this is the last case study I'll discuss. Mrs. ZB was suffering from an acute mental illness after the birth of her daughter. Finkelstein noted that it was the family's housing that was a major problem. Their apartment had no outside windows, and lights had to be kept on at all times. Living in such a nightmarish situation probably contributed to this mother's postpartum depression, and she had attempted suicide. The baby was admitted eventually to the orphanage, and then Finkelstein set out to help this family find a better place to live. The parents found an unheated suite that consisted of 2 rooms on different floors. This situation was unlivable, and Finkelstein refused to help them secure this apartment. Finkelstein was concerned about the next suite that the ZB couple found, as it had been condemned by the city's health department. But they had many friends living in the apartment block, so Finkelstein called the health department to allow them to live there in spite of its poor condition. The baby was soon after discharged back to her parents. All of Finkelstein's work in the ZB case was focused on solving the immediate problem of housing. Finkelstein was not interested in deeper psychological explanations for Mrs. ZB's suicide attempt, although her assessment that an unlit apartment contributed to poor mental health was probably correct. There's no indication in the ZB record or in the later oral history that Finkelstein ever asked herself why landlords were able to rent homes in such poor condition, or why the city health department was unable to force owners to maintain their property. The larger underlying causes of poverty in Winnipeg never entered into Finkelstein's analysis. This was not because Pearl Finkelstein was unintelligent, but rather that she was used to viewing her work as projects to be fixed instead of a piece of a larger whole. Even Finkelstein's ability to connect with any person and to situate herself and those around her within the comforting embrace of community could sometimes work against her clients. In my dissertation, I found evidence from multiple sources, including the children's records, that the superintendent, Aaron Osofsky, was abusive to both children and adults. But in her oral history, Finkelstein rejected all claims that Osofsky could be abusive. To Finkelstein, Osofsky was not merely one individual man who had abused the children of the orphanage. He was a person in the network of her relationships that she knew so well, and she knew his children. As a father, he was a success. Although she was fond of all of the orphanage children, Finkelstein never did connect their inability to trust adults, something that she acknowledged in her oral history, with abuse they may have received at the hands of orphanage staff. This was a truth about life that Pearl Finkelstein was unable to face, that there are abusive people in the world, even if they're situated within your networks. Finkelstein never excluded people from her circle due to class, usually to good effect. In her oral history, she relayed a story about delivering a Hanukkah charity hamper to a poor family when she was part of the National Council of Jewish Women Juniors, and noted that the oldest child in that family was now related to her by marriage. To Finkelstein, the people she met were part of her network or potentially so. This lack of discrimination gave her the ability to empathize with her clients and to be pleased about relatives marrying into families which had once been poor. But it also meant that Finkelstein could sometimes show a lack of analysis. If Finkelstein had pursued social work training in another city, she would have seen many kinds of crises that people encountered without being distracted by the overlapping relationships that they all shared with her. This is not to say that Finkelstein wasn't effective at her job, as she worked hard to help her clients without judgment and moralizing, and she did indeed solve their problems. But her lack of worldly experience and education meant that the status quo in Winnipeg was never challenged by this particular Jewish social worker. I mean, that sounds pretty critical, but I really love Pearl Finkelstein. Pearl Finkelstein Silver worked very hard without much historical recognition. As a working woman, she was able to use her experience as a dedicated volunteer to transition into a new career. This career became her life for many years, and it is undeniable that she was able to help many Winnipeggers. When reading her notes, I was struck by how friendly her tone was to her clients and how willing she was to see their virtues instead of their flaws. Finkelstein did not deliver lectures. Instead, she dedicated herself to her clients' difficulties and was willing to listen to their needs. She chose a life of service, and because of her choice, the orphanage children were found jobs, foster homes, and had a softer launch into the world. Families who needed the orphanage temporarily for childcare were given help in finding new homes, work, or medical care in order to bring their children home. The history of the Winnipeg Jewish community often focuses on the men who established institutions and ran them, but the women who fundraised, planned, and ran the institutions as paid staff can sometimes remain anonymous. The extent of Pearl Finkelstein's work was unaccounted for in official histories, but the Jewish orphanage children's records revealed just how much work she did to help Winnipeg families and children during the Depression.
Thank you very much, Sharon, for that look at not only Pearl Finkelstein, but through her eyes or through her activities on some of the less pleasant sides of the Winnipeg Jewish community, for that matter, any community, especially in the 1930s. But not everything is sweetness and light, and it's good that we know about it. There haven't been any questions that have come in, so I will take the opportunity to ask you what kind of social work training was available at that time, and what kind of social work training did her counterparts in other agencies and other orphanages have?
So I can tell you that there was no social work program in Winnipeg until the late 1940s. And that a formally trained social worker, Thelma Tesler, was hired in the 40s. And I believe she was hired from another city. So if she had wanted to remain local, Pearl Finkelstein could not have received a formal social work education. However, there were, as I said, other social work programs, especially in the United States, which Jane Wisdom was able to access. I'm not sure what kind of training other social workers had. I don't get the sense from the notes that they were any more professional than Finkelstein, and they might have even been a touch less professional than Finkelstein. So I think that in Winnipeg, a lot of it was on the ground training of people who had been working as volunteers and not-for-profits and sort of segued into a for-profit as social workers.
Questions come in, although on the chat line. Nevertheless, how did you find out about Pearl Finkelstein and come to focus on her?
So I was reading through the children's records in the care of the Winnipeg Jewish Child and Family Service, and there were notes that were written that were very detailed and that were very well written, and they just they were amazing. And I would start looking for initials under the notes, and I know the initials PF. It was about a third of the way in before I saw a letter signed by Pearl Finkelstein, and I was able to backtrack and say, oh, this woman who's been writing these notes, or this person who's been writing these notes, PF is Pearl Finkelstein.
Another question's come in about, well, it's amazing that social workers were partly volunteer and they could do so much good with the teenagers. Did they track them as young adults, that is after they left the orphanage?
Not really. Not during Finkelstein's tenure in the 1930s. In the 1940s, if the child grew into a young adult and still needed social care, then the file would continue. If the family was sort of situated in a good place, they would actually close the file. There was one family where the family itself had a lot of problems, a lot of illness, and so the files actually kept going until I think the 1940s. But of course, eventually the teens would grow up and find their own way, and many of them would write letters back to the orphanage or to the superintendent. Nothing was formal. Everything was done according to what Pearl and the superintendent thought was best.
Questions are coming in faster than I can keep up with them. What kind of a more general question about the about education at the orphanage, and perhaps let me put it, well, what kind of education did they? The question is, was the education the children received a mixture of Yiddish studies and secular studies?
So the children attended Luxton Public School, a 10-minute walk away, for elementary school. And if they stayed for high school, they attended at St. John's. And then after school, they had their own branch of the Talmud Torah located in the orphanage building. And they received afternoon school from about 4 p.m. to 6 or so. So it seems like they were given some Yiddish instruction, but their Yiddish wasn't as good as the Nile parrots instruction, but they received a very good religious education.
Maybe I'll add this a little bit about the religious services that were available at the orphanage.
Yes, there was a synagogue on site, and the children also had a really well-known choir where they would perform. They held their own Passover seders, and when the orphanage started admitting boarding students, part of the reason why the boarding students would attend if they were boys so that they could prepare for and even have a bar mitzvah on site at the orphanage, a catered bar mitzvah party, the whole thing. Children from the neighborhood, because they were on the east side of Maine, so separate from the very vibrant Jewish center of the North End, children from that neighborhood would often attend Talmud Torah classes on the orphanage grounds.
A couple of questions about what it meant to be an orphan. Who was an orphan? Who was accepted into the orphanage? You refer to orphans with parents, which sounds paradoxical.
Very few of these children were full orphans. Very few of the children had no living parent. A number of them had one parent who was struggling after the death of the other parent. Many of them had two parents and were placed in the orphanage for a very temporary period, while one parent, usually the mother, entered the hospital, and the breadwinner of the family had to keep working. Some children were there because their parents had abandoned them. Usually that was just one parent, but I found that both male and female parents abandoned their children occasionally in the orphanage, just dropped them off and never came back.
We know several people who lived outside Winnipeg who came into the orphanage for an education. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yes, in about 1935, Mr. Wilder started a program that was accepting children as boarding students. These were children from middle-class rural families who didn't have much of an opportunity to get a Jewish education. And their parents would usually pay full fare for them, although some children's families were actually sort of on the border of needing help from the orphanage and actually had a bit of a subsidy for their maintenance payments. So what happened was that instead of the orphanage being a sequestered place for poor children, there was a certain amount of class mixing within the orphanage itself. The children who came from rural areas, however, didn't tend to stay longer than a year or two, from what I've seen.
In her, Pearl, she didn't write a memoir as such, but she gave a long oral history interview, which was well after the fact. How did she report on it? Did she talk about being stressed? Did she talk about being worried or sad or?
No, she loved it. She loved her work. She reported being very dedicated and enjoying basically every minute of it. She talked about how much she invested in the children, especially the teens. She really worked very hard for those teenagers. And she told a funny story. So Finkelstein married Saul Silver, who ran Western Glove Works. And I think she quit working at the orphanage either just before or soon after she got married. And just before she married him, when they were either engaged or seriously dating, she asked Mr. Silver to find one of the orphans a job. And he did. And this orphan was of course a mess because he was only 16 and he wasn't really ready for the responsibility. And so she said, said that she actually lied to Mr. Silver. She said, "Oh, no, he had no problems. Oh, he's a great kid," just so that she would be able to find him a job. So she loved her work.
Did that contribute to the marriage?
I don't know. She seemed very happy with the marriage, and she married close to 40, or when she was 40. She lived a very full life.
There's a question about whether, well, I had claimed that Pearl Finkelstein didn't fit into your dissertation, which I think was, from what you say, was a bit of an exaggeration. But could you define how this is different from the dissertation and your treatment of Finkelstein?
In the dissertation, I looked at how I put her into a chapter about power, about how she was able to use her position as a volunteer to acquire a new career. But I'm going to be turning my dissertation into a book, and I was sort of pushed by one of my committee members who works more in women's history to explore what the experience of a woman working in this field would have been like. And I think that I really enjoyed reshaping this work to not just talk about how she transitioned from volunteer to working woman, but also to sort of delve into her approach and into the field as a whole.
In your presentation to the Heritage Center a couple of years ago, at a much earlier stage, and now again tonight, you talked about Ossofsky in terms of abuse. Would you say more about that, perhaps define it and see how it was treated?
I worked very hard to define it in my dissertation. There were always rumors that he abused some of the children. I found mentions in at least 2 of the children's records of him once striking a child and another time, in a memoir actually, where as a child, this child remembered being hit very hard for a very tiny infraction. And also in the records, a mother accusing Ossofsky of flying into a rage and throwing her across the room. In my dissertation, I actually did explore what counted as child abuse and what counted as discipline in Canadian education settings. And I still come to the conclusion that if this never happened in Canada, but if a parent had tried to bring charges against Ossofsky, according to the law, he would have been charged. So I can say that I have read accounts where he was physically abusive with children and with a mother, and that those were not considered standard educational practice.
This is not sexual abuse, though.
I didn't find any written allegations of sexual abuse, though someone in the community did tell me that their grandmother stated that she had been sexually abused by him. But I didn't find evidence.
In your dissertation, you do talk about relations among the students, among the boarders.
Boarders and all the children. There was the problem in large children's institutions is that the children are at risk from staff members, but also from older children. So instances of sexual abuse in the orphanage that were recorded in the children's records were between older children and younger children.
Mm-hmm. Could you say more about the more attractive sides of Mr. Ossofsky's character and activities?
He worked very hard, and he established the pattern of the superintendent traveling around the furthest reaches of the prairies in order to solicit donations from Western Canadian Jews, yes, for the upkeep of the orphanage, which was very expensive to maintain, but also to create connections. And those connections were continued by Mr. Wilder, who followed him as superintendent. Those connections created this community that overcame geographic distance. So one of the practices of the orphanage was sending teenagers out to rural shopkeepers to clerk, to keep some books, to do some inventory, and then also to teach the children of that family in Jewish topics. And I have to say, I don't think it was very successful, that the teenagers tended to have the same problem, that they were too young to be on their own. They didn't know how to manage their money. They didn't know how to manage their relationships with the families with whom they lived. And they weren't terribly great teachers. But what was amazing was how many of these families both Osofsky and later Wilder knew personally and could talk about. And children did continue to write to Osofsky long after they had left the orphanage. He was the only father that they had known in many cases, and he worked very hard on their behalf. But he was also, I mean, it was, everybody's a mixed bag. And that was the unpleasant side of his personality.
The next question is whether you can compare, how could you compare the social work activities at the orphanage, the Jewish orphanage, with the social work activities at non-Jewish orphanages or other other social work activities in the city of Winnipeg?
So first of all, none of the non-Jewish orphanages were also children's aid societies. Only the Jewish orphanage took on both roles. So that an orphanage usually, its borders were inside its walls. Not enough research has been done on the other orphanages. I can say that they were often sex segregated, and they often had some kind of child saving mission. The children's home in Tuxedo took in mostly girls and seemed to produce a cadre of well-respected, church-going, educated women. The Knox home for boys appeared to provide a certain rough and tumble, but very nurturing home for boys. I haven't found out too much about what happened with the Catholic institutions, but social work itself, as the time period of the orphanage went on that I studied, it became more and more run by the city of Winnipeg. So it was a municipal affair and became more and more integrated within the city's bureaucracy. I could talk about this for hours, so I'm going to restrain myself.
Well, let's jump to the, when the orphanage closed, what happened to the orphans?
Most of them were too old to be in an orphanage.
New orphans.
There were fewer and fewer orphans because as the war went on, more and more people had work. And the reasons why children were being put into orphanages were two very clear reasons. Parents had no money and parents had no childcare. As extended families became more financially stable, they could take care of children whose mother went into the hospital. So a bettering economy just almost emptied the orphanage. The other thing is that lack of childcare was also sometimes related. There was no daycare. There was one daycare in the city, the Stella Avenue Day Nursery, which had very limited hours. But as more women worked during the war, I don't know this for sure, but I think there may have been more childcare options.
Another question, if you're not too tired. Seems to me that in the 1920s and 30s, married women were not allowed to hold a paying job. Was she married then? Well, and what did she not get paid?
Okay, so first of all, in the 1920s and 30s, married women were 100% able to have a job, and many women did, but they were poor. So lots and lots and lots of women worked in the 1920s and 30s if they could find work. Working class women, it was normal for them to work in a variety of economic as well as home-based economic activities. But for a profession such as nursing, teaching, or in this case, social work, it was expected that a woman would quit when she married. And I believe that Finkelstein quit her job when she married Saul Silver.
Here's a somewhat different approach. What archival material about the orphanage did you find at the Jewish Heritage Center?
Oh, the Jewish Heritage Center has so much archival material. The Jewish Heritage Center has boxes of archival material. There are annual reports, at least 3 of them, very rich in information. There are, I believe, photos and photo albums from the orphanage, many, many photos. There's also some internal board memos and documents. There's files on the Orphanage Alumni Association, which I hardly ever get to talk about, but which included some memoirs and some reminiscences about their time in the orphanage. So there's a lot there. There's also, I had a whole section on newspapers. There was plenty in the Winnipeg Free Press and in the Minute and in the Tribune, as well as in the Jewish Post, which of course is held by the Jewish Heritage Center, and the Israelite Press, which is in Yiddish. Just more material. I was very lucky. You can't do a doctoral dissertation without information, and boy, did I find it.
There are a couple of follow-up. Let's see if I can find them. Were there any documents that you would like to have seen that were not available?
When it came to the orphanage, to have been granted access to the children's records was such a hard process because there were private information and health information. So I basically was too busy looking at that information to worry about what else I couldn't find. I think what I wish is that there was more information on some of the other Winnipeg orphanages. I did some research on them and some research on the other Jewish orphanages in Canada, but I couldn't devote the time. So if anybody wants to do more research on some of these orphanages, you know, it's a gap. It's a gap.
I think you've already covered this, but what were the circumstances that led to the closing of the orphanage, and what happened with Pearl?
So I think I did cover it because the orphanage basically had to close. It was getting emptier and emptier. And also the world was switching to the foster home ideal. There was a general feeling that institutions were not good for children and that foster homes are better. I think on the whole, I agree with that statement, although the orphanage did a lot of good and a lot of people were very happy to have gone there. There was definitely a feeling expressed by many of the children when they became teenagers that they felt very alone in the world. And then Pearl, of course, got married. And there were further Jewish social workers who replaced her.
Did she have children?
She definitely had children because either she had children or she married. I can't tell if they were children or stepchildren. My sense is that there was less of the consciousness of the boundary for Finkelstein, if they were her children or her stepchildren, but her family is alive and well. And Maida Markson, Pearl's stepdaughter, provided me with the 2 personal photos of Pearl Finkelstein. So thank you very much.
And I think final, a statement from the Earl Cooperman family saying, Earl, not a question, Earl Cooperman is watching this program. He made a match between head nurse Bella Nuremberg and his father. He's a retired pediatrician.
Yes, Miss Nuremberg was all over the records, and she was a very kind presence in the children's lives. In addition to the superintendents, children who were away from the orphanage or who had aged out wrote to Miss Nuremberg quite often.
There are a few more, if I will try, if you can handle it, if you're not giving out, it's getting on the. Did the orphanage seek to integrate children into the Jewish community while in the orphanage?
Yes. Yes, there were plenty of attempts to have children go to afternoon activities in the Jewish community. I believe they may have attended the Y. Certainly life back then for children as a whole was very different, and children had a curfew, which meant that until the curfew, they were out. It wasn't locked. I guess they were of a certain age, 11 or 12 and up or whatever, but they were out. They were wandering around. They were visiting their family. And these were children who had family, usually in the city, family or friends. If they didn't have family of their own, then members of the orphanage board would often try to adopt them and take them in, maybe occasionally, bring them presents, have a visit with them. So I even found a letter from a woman who was the friend of a mother who visited a child and wrote to one of the superintendents to say, he wasn't wearing a proper jacket for the weather, and I'm very disappointed in you. So there, and then after they graduated, they were, of course, sent to the city or to rural families. So fostering and maintaining kinship networks was definitely seen as important.
Yeah, you've quite fairly brought out some of the negative sides of the orphanage, but on the whole, it had a terrific reputation, and many of the people who went there have nothing but fond memories, or at least have overwhelmingly fond memories of their experience. And if the primary, I guess that would be still the primary memoir on the subject by Reuben Slonim, is It's Grand to Be an Orphan.
Yes, yes. I mean, it was, look, this is an institution that was run by a large group of Jewish mommies and daddies and babas and zaydas. So the children were cared for, and definitely it was not a punitive place. It was a place that really did try to be nurturing. I do feel after having done all this research that I don't think any very large childcare institution is probably a good idea. Children need individual attention. And it looks like, from reading these records, also, I think teenagers really need individual attention, which is funny because we don't think that they do. But Pearl really tried to give them that individual attention. So she really stepped into that gap.
You interviewed, well, I'll take the wording of the question. Have you interviewed any of the children who are now seniors? And if so, what types of memories did they share?
So I did put out a call for people to provide me with oral histories. I published a request in the Jewish Post. There were some limits on what I could do to get people to participate in doing an oral history. And in the end, I didn't get anybody who really firmly wanted to do this. I wasn't allowed to contact people, for example, directly, because of the limits that were put on me by the Research Ethics Board. That actually is something I would have liked to have gained more of, which is their memories. I've talked with people who lived in the orphanage informally, and they were usually, some of them were very happy about living there. Some of them weren't. In the same way that some children really thrive at overnight camp, and some children find it torture. Only if you were an orphan, you were stuck there. So even when it was run by very caring people, and it was still, it wouldn't fit everybody.
Well, I remember very well the presentation you made to the Heritage Center. What was it, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, whatever it was?
It was 7.
Really?
Yes.
The room was, there were at least 2 or 3 dozen graduates of the orphanage who got up to speak and share their memories at that time. And I remember them being enthusiastic. Perhaps they saved some of their more negative comments for more private circumstances, but it was it gave the feeling of a very good place to be if you had to be there.
I think that the orphanage might have been a great place to be, but the family crisis that brought them to the orphanage wasn't always something that people necessarily want to revisit in their memories. So that's why orphanages are sort of complicated, even when they're positive, because they represent that family rupture that sometimes is only temporary, but it's still traumatic sometimes.
I'm well, going to wind this down because it's it's going pleasantly long. But would you say how Pearl built her networks with employers? And the question is, did she draw on family connections?
Oh, yes. Oh, she drew on every connection she could find. She had, of course, grown up in the big Finkelstein family, which was very prominent, and which was engaged in a number of different businesses, from stores to farming to rental properties. And so she knew people personally quite well. And if she didn't know them, then a friend of hers did know them. And she used them shamelessly. People weren't afraid to say no to her, but she'd keep trying. To find a job for an unskilled 16-year-old in the 1930s, she needed every single connection she had.
I think some of these are more or less repeating, but anyway, someone who chose to be anonymous but isn't by the question says that, as you know, my mother, Babe Hirschfield, worked at the orphanage in the office. She would have known Pearl, and when she went into the Sharon home as a resident, she reconnected with one of the orphan children, Hershey Brownstone. The comment it cuts off for some technical reason that I don't know.
Yeah. So, hi, Susan. Hi, Susan. Yes, I know your mother was, she was known as, so you knew her as Babe Hirschfield, and in the records, she was Dorothy Tuberman. And, or Tuberman. So I knew your mother through the records very well without knowing that I knew your mother. And what was really funny was when occasionally she would write a little note to the orphanage. She worked as the secretary in the office. She would write a note to one of the teenagers, and they would write back, and they would talk to her about as Tubby or Tubby, which was really cute. Yeah.
I'm going to give the final word to the birthday boy, who says, in my professional life, I met many untrained social workers. Many were excellent despite their lack of formal education.
Definitely.
So I thank you very much, Sharon, for the discussion, for the presentation and the discussion. Thank you very much, the attendees who've asked many very interesting questions and moved us into other directions that weren't touched, or deepened the knowledge that we have of it. Thank you very much to Paul and Fred Switzer and the Switzer family for creating this wonderful opportunity this year and in many other years. And I thank Beljanevsky, the executive director, for doing the technical work here and then calling on troops if we absolutely need them. Greg Mordero, Stan Carbone worked on this, and Mark Cantor, of course, who introduced this all. So I'm going to bring this to an end. Unfortunately, this year we can't invite you for coffee and cookies, but please, as soon as we leave this meeting, would you go into the kitchen and have coffee and cookies and think of us. So good night, and thank you very much all.
Thank you.